To follow up on immigration, deporting American citizens to Central American prisons, is it legal, or do you need to change the law to do it?
Well, it's another question that the president has raised. It's a legal question that the president is looking into. And he talked about this yesterday with his meeting with President Bukele in the Oval Office. He would only consider this, if legal, for Americans who are the most violent, egregious, repeat offenders of crime who nobody in this room wants living in their communities.
And thank you, Carolyn Levitt, for making everything perfectly clear. This is Claire Potter.
This is Neil J. Young.
And this is the Are We All Deportable episode. Neil, I hope we're not all deportable, but who knows?
Well, the president has suggested as much that we might all be just this week. So
I know. So we have to talk about it, and we have to talk about Chris Van Hollen's visit to CCOT. We're going to start with the news, but I just want to begin by saying, Neil, it's finally spring in New England.
I'm seeing the pictures of, flowering trees and daffodils and all that stuff from my friends in the Northeast. It's cold here in LA, so we are on a different time schedule when it comes to seasons, but happy for y'all in the Northeast.
Really, really. Well, we feel badly for all of you in LA because you have such terrible weather all year round. So, okay, I won't sing Springtime for Hitler, although it was in my head. But we're going to start with the news roundup. We're going to begin with some alarming and sad news. All classes and events have been canceled today at Florida State University at Tallahassee after a mass shooting. There were 8 casualties. As far as I know, 2 of those people have died. Neither of them are students, but I don't know who they are. The culprit, sadly, is another FSU student who is 20 years old. His mother is a long-term sheriff's deputy in Tallahassee. She's been working with the department for 18 years, and the murder weapon was her personal firearm. Florida has very expansive gun laws, although state statutes actually would have prohibited this man from purchasing his own weapon until he was 21. I also want to say part of the grisly news that just sort of layers and layers on these events is FSU experienced a mass shooting in 2014, but there are people on the FSU campus who were also Parkland adjacent and experienced other shootings in their high schools. Neil, what do you think?
Yeah, this is just awful news. I will say one of the victims has just been identified today.
Okay.
His name is, I believe, Robert Morales, a middle-aged man, graduated actually from FSU in the 90s and apparently was a quite successful restaurant owner in Tallahassee. So I don't know if he was on campus because it was, he was working in the student center with some sort of food-related, work or what was happening. But, condolences are pouring in for him on Twitter right now, or X, whatever we call it these days. I will say, as I think, listeners know, I'm a native Floridian, born and raised in the Central Florida area. All of my family lives outside of Orlando, which is to say that I have lots and lots of friends who have kids who are students at FSU right now. Right. And my Facebook feed yesterday was filled with people I grew up with, freaking out about the safety of their children and, contacting each other and then posting that their daughter or their son was safe and checking on their other friends. So it was, these things happen over and over again. And I think we all are, obviously moved and disturbed by them, but sometimes they come really close to home. And this was one of those. And it's a heartbreaking moment. I mean, thank goodness it wasn't worse. But this is, just yet another awful event in our gun-ridden culture.
Yeah, it's really awful. And for any historians who are watching this video cast, I have been in touch with our colleague Paul Renfro, who's in the history department at FSU. He's as fine as you can be under these circumstances, and he was grateful to hear from us. Yeah. And, I just want to say there are more and more of us who have been through these events. I went through a campus shooting at Wesleyan University back, I think, in 2010, and you really never forget it. And, there are people who are killed, there are people who are wounded, but then the damage from these things just reverberates outwards and it changes your life forever.
Totally.
So, still on campus with this news, Harvard becomes the first university to reject making a deal with President Donald J. Trump. Last week, the university received a 5-page list of demands that would have essentially put the university into receivership to the United States government. As a result, $2.2 billion in funding has been frozen, with another $5 billion at stake. The administration has also announced plans to strip Harvard of its tax-exempt status and end visas for international students. I heard a podcaster this morning when I was in the car saying that Donald Trump has accomplished something that no one has ever accomplished before, which is making Harvard popular.
Yeah.
So what do you think, Neil? What do you think is going to happen next? And what are the stakes here?
Well, I think further retaliation from the Trump administration, but that would have happened regardless, as we saw with the example of Colombia.
Right.
Colombia capitulated, and then it got even more, more things thrown at it from the Trump administration. So Harvard,
Right.
very importantly, bravely and boldly, isn't going down that path. And I think that's really, really important. I think this is an incredibly important line of defense, that an institution as powerful and as wealthy as Harvard is best positioned to make, and also that will have reverberations for other universities. And that's really important here as well, because you don't want Columbia to be the model. You
Right.
want Harvard to be the model. And you've seen other universities sort of stand in solidarity with Harvard and this decision in all sorts of different ways. And hopefully they will also do so in terms of any sort of interactions they have with the Trump administration. But I think this is an incredibly important line drawn in the sand that we need done by other institutions and other powerful people when the Trump, when the Trump spotlight comes their way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was in touch with my friend Taya Miles, who's in the history department at Harvard, and basically said, "Yay, Harvard, we're all on your side." And she said, yes, it's a huge relief, but we're all also very anxious. And I think it's going to put everyone at Harvard and everybody at every university that's affected by these kind of attacks on a rather long trajectory of not knowing what the future looks like, which seems to be the Trump administration's way of trying to subdue all of us. You mentioned Colombia, Neil. I wanted to point everyone to a piece by my friend Matt Connolly, also a historian, in the New York Times on April 16th. It was called, "I'm a Columbia Professor. Here's the really disheartening part of this mess." And what Matt is talking about is the relentless attacks on Columbia by left academics who have kind of been at the center of all of this campus protest to begin with. And hundreds of them have now signed a letter saying that they are going to boycott Columbia in all regards. And Matt sort of put out this plea to say, hey, this is the moment. We need people to stand in solidarity, not to continue to undermine us. You're a Columbia grad. Neil, what are your feelings about what's going on there?
Yeah, I'm a Columbia grad. I will say I have no sort of real feelings or attachment to the university, or no real affection for it. I appreciate the education I got there, but it's not this school that sort of makes my heart beat in the way that my undergraduate institution does. And I think in some ways there's an impersonal nature to Columbia that actually shapes a lot of the ways in which even those who are its alums and its current students, how they act towards it in these moments. But I think I haven't read Matt's piece yet. It's bookmarked, and I wish I'd gotten to it before we recorded. But I've heard a lot of people talking about it, and I think I'm sort of not a boycott person to begin with. That's just not really in my arsenal with political responses. I think it's in part because I grew up in a religious conservative environment in which I often heard about, people at church boycotting things over what, as a young kid, struck me as just the most silly things ever. And so I have a bit of a recoil to that sort of way of going about things. But I think especially a boycott of Columbia in this moment is to do Trump's bidding in a lot of ways. Right. And I think I don't think we should have just sort of blind solidarity in all moments, but I think this is a moment in which unity and keeping your eyes focused on what really is the huge danger here and the huge threat is important. And attacking Colombia at a moment in which a presidential administration is also doing so doesn't seem to me the right strategy for how things get better.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm not a boycott person either. I'm beginning to feel like the whole political impetus that drove last year's protests was so 20th century. And that if we're actually going to do politics in this new environment, we have to stop doing what is the reflex, which is attack the nearest institution, maybe even the one that employs you. If you look at the people who signed this letter, frankly, I don't think anybody who works at Princeton has any business attacking people at Columbia for the decisions they make. I just really, really don't. There's an awful lot of privilege roiling around, and I won't implicate you in this mess. This is my opinion and my opinion only. But I do think one of the big differences between Harvard and Columbia is, first of all, Columbia was targeted from the beginning. It was targeted by Students for Justice in Palestine and all of those associated groups because New York media market always is. But I also think there's a real difference in the leadership and how deep the bench was for the leadership to deal with this crisis. And Columbia's leadership clearly was pretty thin and pretty divided and pretty unprepared for what happened. And Harvard seems to have been pretty deep and pretty solid. I mean, Claudine Gay took a terrible hit, and I was reflecting on that and thinking, well, she was a person who was perfectly capable of running a university, but maybe she didn't have the experience to fight a president and a political party. And then Alan Garber stepped up, and it appears that he does, and he has a lot of people around him to help him do that. But I really think it's time for all of us who are academics to begin to realize that attacking our own institutions in the face of an authoritarian president who wants to undo education completely is a very, very bad idea.
Completely. And I think your point about leadership is really, I think that's right. I think that's a big factor here. I mean, Columbia is currently led by an interim president who's Claire Shipman, former ABC journalist, very talented in that role, but former anchor of 2020 or whatever it is that she's done in her career at ABC is not the person that should be leading a global research institution like Columbia University in normal times, let alone when this is going on. So, I mean, that's not to put anything on Claire Shipman. She's caught in a bad situation at a really horrific time, but it is to say that the Board of Trustees, I don't think, have served this institution well by not putting by not having better leadership in place as this is going on. And I think that, again, this isn't the one thing that's determining what everything happens with Columbia, but the response here feels like it is something that, as we've seen, has only facilitated the Trump administration's further attacks. And I think it's great to see that Harvard is standing up to this, using all the power that it has behind it, because in doing so, it will hopefully help, less powerful, less wealthy institutions to hold firm to their principles and to do something similar.
Right. I see a Supreme Court case called Harvard v. Trump. And okay, so I want to move on to our third item of news, in which we see a whistleblower emerging from the NLRB who has come forward to say that Elon Musk and DOGE have not only invaded the data that they had actually no right to, but he's describing a massive export of sensitive and confidential data from that agency, specifically related to labor organizing and specifically related to cases that Elon Musk is implicated in. There are so many troublesome facts about this. A few of them are that minutes after the DOGE work began, there were repeated login attempts from a Russian IP address. The logs were turned off. And for people who don't know computer systems, the logs record absolutely everything that happens in the system. So that if something goes wrong, you can go backwards and find out, well, their log information is just gone for this period. And what looks to be a link to a new backdoor into the system was posted on GitHub. Okay. I mean, astonishing. And when Barulis started poking around, he began to receive anonymous threats, some of which showed that he was being surveilled by persons unknown. There was a shot of him that was pinned to his door of him walking his dog that was clearly taken from a drone. Neil, we are entering into very serious Matrix territory here.
Absolutely. And this is terrifying. I don't see how this is not a five alarm fire that's happening right now. But how can you keep up when everything else is going on? But this should have everyone really scared. I mean, let's just speak about the bravery of this man in coming forward, especially in a week in which the president himself has suggested that Americans might be deportable. And that Gorka is saying that anyone who objects to the president's agenda is a terrorist. And so, I mean, so therefore they should be removed in similar situations. And so we know that journalists, that whistleblowers, that truth tellers of any type will be particularly vulnerable when those actions start happening. And I can't imagine the bravery of doing something like that. We owe him a huge debt of gratitude for this. And again, I feel like I say this every week, but where are the Republicans that stand up and say this is wrong? This cannot happen. This is a major threat to national security and a violation of every American's rights to have their privacy protected and their information protected by the U.S. government, and certainly not made accessible by an enemy state.
Right. Well, and here's another profiling courage for you. This was also the week that the Trump administration went after the funding for NPR and PBS, otherwise known as the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I believe that these are the outlets that Barulis went to with his story. I saw him on NPR, PBS NewsHour, being interviewed by Amna Nawaz and telling his story there. And so whatever producer at PBS and NPR decided, okay, in the week that they're going to take away our funding, or they're trying to, we're going to platform this guy. I thought, all media should be watching these people.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. So, Neil, you gave us an obvious segue into our focus for today, which is the question of whether we are all deportable. Now, I want to begin with news that I think everybody's learned by now, which is that Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen, who went to El Salvador, got within about 3 kilometers of Sikot prison, which is the sort of terror prison, dungeon, gulag that Bukele is keeping in El Salvador. He got within 3 kilometers. He was met by the military. They told him, no, you have to turn back. And he said, actually, other cars were just like going by, but his car was singled out. And they said, no, you have to return. But late last night, I got home from my writing group to find a post on Threads that Van Hollen had actually met with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the wrongly deported man who has become the face of the 261 migrants who are being held in Sikot prison. Many of them have been illegally deported as well. And the charge is, of course, that they are all violent criminals. And our friend Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, says, I can't believe Democrats care more about violent criminals than they do about ordinary Americans. What's the significance of Van Hollen getting to Garcia?
Well, I think it's incredibly important because just the fact that he did that was, I think, a huge media moment. And also the picture is, I think, really powerful. Yeah. Although it's being used, and as you've pointed out, by the right and by the White House to suggest that this is, support for we have 2 parties in this country, as Stephen Miller said yesterday. One party led by a president who wants to protect Americans, the other party led by people like AOC who want to, protect violent criminals. So it's, they're just reinforcing the allegations that they've not decided to pursue in court or through our legal process, right? But I think that this is a really important moment historically. I mean, I think that this is a picture that will be in history books and it's a powerful one. And I think that, the Trump administration is going to continue to lie about this.
Right.
As they are also lying about the Supreme Court decision that is connected to this.
Right.
And doing it with straight faces. I mean, right? Like Trump is saying they won 9-0 when it was a 9-0 decision against them. So all reality is being thrown out the window, obviously, over and over again with this administration. It's so obvious with this particular example, just how like horrific and barbaric it is, but also that this is like a fundamental issue of whether or not our democracy holds and whether or not the Constitution will be adhered to. And this is a crisis. And
Right.
I think we can't say that loudly enough. And I also think it's wild that it's not getting more attention. As much attention as it's not getting the sort of direct attention for what this means as a constitutional crisis and a vast overreach by this president.
Yeah. And, I was thinking about a couple of comparisons. One, of course, was Guantanamo, which we were all horrified by, continue to be horrified by. Guantanamo was really just the hub for a range of black sites all over the world. And for viewers who don't know, a black site is basically something that's not labeled a prison, but it is a prison and it's a detention center and people are tortured and interrogated there. But actually, once you got to Guantanamo, you could see a lawyer. People had lawyers. They could be in contact with your families. There was proof of life, right? And one of the issues with CCOT is that the prisoners are all incommunicado. No connection to family, no connection to attorneys, no proof that they are dead or alive. And of course, there is an old principle in English common law on which American law is based, which is habeas corpus.
Absolutely.
And, in the United States, typically, when your lawyer comes to the jail, he comes with a writ or she comes with a writ of habeas corpus. That means literally show me the body, show me the person that's here. And that was such a huge aspect of the American Revolution because, of course, the King of England didn't have to do that. The King of France didn't have to do that. You could just put people in prison and not tell anybody anything about them. And that's where we are. So that's one comparison I had. The other comparison is Putin's Russia, where again, the entire legal system is a sham, but they walk people in and out of court. Like I remember watching the Brittany Griner proceedings. People knew where she was most of the time. Sometimes she was in transit and they didn't for a few hours, but she had lawyers. She was connected to the embassy. She was occasionally connected to her wife. This is worse than that, Neil.
Yeah, it is worse than that. And I think in part because of just the absolute violation of it and also the sort of bold-faced way the administration is going about it. I mean, right, this isn't being done under, cover of night. Like they're loudly sort of proclaiming what they're doing as part of the executive's power. So that's, the real crisis of it and also the scale of it. The fact that like 90+% of these folks are not criminals, but they've been deemed as such by administration just because they said they are, and that these are not being deported. They are being jailed for the rest of their life in a torture chamber, in which we're in cahoots with a autocratic leader, both of whom are saying they are incapable of fixing this situation, right? I mean, that was part of the thing that came up at the White House meeting, that both of them sort of looked at each other like, well, I can't do anything. Well, I can't do anything. This is the leader, the most important person, the most powerful man in the world, Trump, just by designation of his office, incapable of doing anything about fixing this situation, including asking the person who is in the room with you, who has control over this prison, to bring him back. I mean, it's wild what's happening here and terrifying, again, because all of this is just an entry point into a much broader abuse of the law, which they are saying that they're going to do.
Right. Well, and it is something that Bukele, who has already done in El Salvador, and for people who are not familiar with the recent history of El Salvador, it is a country that was utterly and completely depleted and destroyed by American intervention in the 1980s, American-backed war on various progressive and communist groups that were trying to take over the government. So the United States has backed this brutality in El Salvador off and on for decades. But Bukele is also responsible for going after the narco terrorists who eventually kind of took over the country by sort of wholesale jailing tens of thousands of people on no charges whatsoever. So the reason CCOT and other prisons like it exist, and believe it or not, there are worse prisons in El Salvador than CCOT, where you don't get like a nice set of white Crocs and a white t-shirt when you come in. He did that by imprisoning entire families, entire villages full of people. It's estimated that somewhere around 60,000 people have been jailed in El Salvador who have actually done nothing wrong at all.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason that this is happening in El Salvador, right? Because of both the history there of the particular relation of the U.S. with this country, and also because of the political conditions within it, right? Like this is right there. This is why, I mean, this is a reason why they're not being sent to like a detention center in Costa Rica. I mean, it's also because Costa Rica probably would not, or similar countries probably would not allow for persons to be brought into their country in such scenarios. But this is a mutually beneficial relationship for two autocratic, dictator types, and one that also I think situates or fits within that longer history of the U.S. involvement in this particular country in sort of all the worst forms.
Right. And let's talk a little bit about the lying. You raised it earlier, Neil. In The Art of the Deal, Donald Trump talks about his practice of creative hyperbole, which is basically lying. But you make up very elaborate stories that seem so real that people believe them, and they don't actually know that you're lying to them until the deed is already done. Is this the same kind of lying that he did as a real estate executive, or is this something quite different?
I mean, it's related, right? But it does feel different. I mean, I got the sense from the sort of Art of the Deal Trump version, and certainly from him as a real estate person. Don't want to call him a magnate or tycoon, but that a lot of it was like smoke and mirrors, right? That this is sort of like the stuff you do of like marketing, right? That you sort of, you play a dog and pony show, that a lot of this is about sort of, pulling people along until they've been able to figure out that actually what you're promising or what you're, saying you have isn't the case, but then it's too late. This is a bold-faced lie. I mean, saying in the Oval Office that you won a decision 9-0 when you lost that decision 9-0 is not the same thing as saying like, have I got a bridge to sell you, right? This is a bold-faced lie. Now, I do think it raises the question, what does Trump actually know? Because I think that's always the question. Like, what is his actual intelligence around this issue? Who knows? If Stephen Miller is telling him he won the case 9-0, there's no reason for us to believe that Trump doesn't actually believe that, because he hasn't read the decision. He's not looking at the New York Times. So I don't know, is this a live omission or commission? I don't know, but we have a pathological liar who is the leader of the free world and is lying, out of every side of his mouth. And the media is still going along with it in a way that I think, it just does not meet the moment. It certainly does not meet this person for who he is and what he's doing to everything.
Right. Well, and if you spend time on X, which I have been a fair amount in the last 6 months, I was off forever because I just couldn't handle it anymore. And then when Trump got reelected, I realized I actually had to go back on because otherwise I wouldn't know what was happening in the White House. And one of the things I see is that they have a very elaborate apparatus of influencers who take these White House lies embroider on them, and then spin them out there. So the narrative among these influencers is, this is an MS-13 member, Garcia.
Yep.
Everybody there is a violent criminal. Why do Democrats care about violent criminals? Why do Democrats want violent criminals to live in Americans' neighborhoods? Trump won the Supreme Court decision. I mean, blah, blah, blah. When, in fact, the only issue here is due process.
Absolutely.
I mean,
it does
Garcia,
not matter any of those things. They're
none
not
of those
true, but
things
it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
It's
none
the
of those things matter.
Constitution.
It's the Constitution. I mean, I don't even know whether Miranda was a nice person or not, but because of Miranda, everybody gets a lawyer in the United States now. I mean, I don't know. You may know more about Miranda than I do, but it doesn't matter. Miranda could have been a serial killer. The fact is, he didn't have a lawyer, and that was unconstitutional. So the question is due process. And now, of course, as we have been talking about, the Trump administration is saying, well, yeah, you know, we could do this with Americans too. I mean, it was mentioned, Trump and Bukele talked about it in their meeting. And then Caroline Leavitt talked about it the next day, and she said, oh, but it would only be the most horrible people, you know? And it's like, A, why would we believe that? And B, it doesn't matter if they're the most horrible people.
It doesn't matter. And also, if they are, she said, heinous repeat offenders. I mean, are these heinous repeat offenders who just are living next door to me and haven't yet been prosecuted and imprisoned? I mean, where these, so is it that we're pulling them out of the prison system? No, this is about pulling people off the street under this expansive definition that they alone can, you know, can determine. And it becomes the sort of it becomes the lens through which everything is not just seen, but is depicted. And I think that is, like, you know, to hold up the choices between, you know, protecting Americans and violent criminals is, of course, to sidestep the whole issue that this is about. But it is to do so in a way that obviously I think has great resonance or great appeal, you know, it works with lots and lots of Americans. But I'm grateful for the people who continue to point out that it's the Constitution that is what we're talking about, and that a handful of them are some never Trump Republicans. But I don't know. I mean, this is enormous. And again, we've said it many times, but it has to be said over and over. The president himself said that this could apply to American citizens just this week. Like, this should terrify every single person. And it just suggests that that's not even the limits of this, but that I think it does speak to the enormous hole being opened up in the center of the Constitution through which anything can happen.
Right. Well, and of course, this was the King's Law in England. I mean, if you were convicted of a crime, say even a pickpocket or a thief or something like that, you could be deported to Australia. I mean, you know, they had penal colonies. France had penal colonies that they deported people to. So what Trump is really talking about is establishing penal colonies for Americans and anybody else that he wants to incarcerate. Now, there's some good news. There's some sunshine here, which apparently the big mistake the Trump administration has made is, and why would Bukele do this otherwise, is they are paying the government of El Salvador to keep these prisoners, right?
Yeah.
Any idea that actually we are saving any money in this administration is ridiculous, but they are paying Bukele. And so that creates two avenues. One avenue is to simply cut off the money, to say, you know, Congress is going to cut off the money. We're not going to pay them anymore. And Bukele is obviously not going to do it for free. But the other one is that then El Salvador is legally acting as the agent of the United States. Therefore, actually, the United States can say to El Salvador, I want you to send them back. And you have to, because they are an agent. And so those are two legal avenues that people are exploring. We're going to leave a link to the SCOTUS decision in the program notes. Everybody should read it. This is like heaven for law clerks, I think. But yesterday, the Fourth Circuit also chimed in and denied the Trump administration's claim that it cannot do anything to reverse the deportation. Neil, is this the constitutional crisis we've been waiting for?
Yeah, but I have a question also about
Yeah,
the decision, because the language of the decision says that the government must facilitate his return, right?
right,
That's the word that's used several times.
right,
I'm curious if you have thoughts about that language, because I'm seeing play it out a bit differently.
right,
On one hand, you have Trump, part of the Trump team who is not claiming that this was a victory, a 9-0
right,
victory, but they're saying, okay, it says we have to facilitate. We're doing that. And this sort of reminds me of like Brown 2 and with all deliberate
right,
speed. Like there's
right,
no enforcement mechanism around it. So you can say like, well, this is my deliberate speed. So
right,
it seems like there's a camp within Team Trump that's sort of going to slow walk that facilitation,
right,
but say that they're complying. But then I also wonder if, like the Stephen Miller side that's saying we won this 9-0, I mean, I
right.
haven't seen him attach that pronouncement to the language of facilitation, but is there a way in which he could say like, oh, they said we have to facilitate it, we'll facilitate it, this means we won the case? Am I making too
Right.
much of this one word? It does seem like it really matters here, that sort of everything hinges on it, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, I agree with you. I think everything does hinge on it. And the messaging from the Trump administration has been various. I mean, we
Right.
have Stephen Miller, as you have said. Caroline Leavitt has said, well, because Chris Van Hollen was saying, open the door of the prison, let him out. Let's see what happens next. Bring him on a plane and bring him back to the United States. And Caroline Leavitt said, well, if he comes back to the United States, then we'll arrest him and detain him. And I was listening to a lawyer say, okay, but that is due process.
Exactly. That's adherence to the Constitution. So do
That's
that.
right.
If you believe
Yes.
that you have the case to make on that, then go
Right.
through the proper channels.
Right. And of course, the other piece of the Trump administration strategy has been to defame Garcia and try to muddy all of this by
Yes.
saying, oh, well, his wife once filed a restraining order against him. Probably did. So did the Secretary of Defense's wife. So, but also saying that he's a member of MS-13, which he is not.
Right.
And they've even gone as far to say that a judge has found that he's a member of MS-13. Another piece of that narrative is the reason he was allowed to stay in the United States was because there was a gang in El Salvador who was targeting him. But because of Bukele, that gang no longer exists. So there's no reason for him to be in the United States, except that gang is in CCOT, if in fact it no longer exists. Right. So, but I agree with you. I think facilitate is the key here. What I would love is if some third country like Canada would step in and say, we're flying a delegation down. We will take him and we will take his family, and just really make a big deal of it. What else do we need to be thinking about, Neil?
Well, I think we need to keep our eyes on this conversation about,
Yep.
what Trump is going to do when it comes to expanding this practice to
Right.
more and more people. And sadly and scarily, I think we're going to see, the next iteration of that on the sooner side, not the
Yep.
later one. In what shape or form it shows up, I don't know. But I think, Gorka himself has said, anyone who speaks in support of this man is therefore a terrorist, which
Right.
means that, almost anyone on Twitter, almost anyone who's published an op-ed or said anything on the
Right.
news, including members of Congress, are in violation of this view that Gorka has, and this is really, really scary.
Yeah, or people who heinously and repeatedly make podcasts that criticize the Trump
Yes.
administration. One thing I would like to put out there, which some of our viewers may know, is that at least 4 Americans who are citizens have received communications from the government telling them to leave the country within 7 days, one of whom is an immigration lawyer in Massachusetts. It is completely unclear whether these were sent by mistake or whether this is sort of like a flyer to see what happens.
Yeah, I can't tell either. I mean, the immigration attorney one, even I think the Trump administration admitted that like her emails were probably on a lot of documents that had been,
Right.
submitted on behalf of her clients to
Right.
the government, and that perhaps that she had sort of in error received this communication because like her email address was caught up in a mass communication on their part,
Right.
which is an incredible admission of their just ineptitude, right?
Right. Right.
But one that sort of makes, I think, a little bit of a logical sense.
Right.
There's a doctor in, I believe, Pennsylvania who's also received this letter and has literally no idea why she has.
Right.
So that, I think, raises the sort of second question you pose, which is this just like we're just trying stuff and seeing what happens?
Right.
And then what's the point of that? Is it that like it's just an act of intimidation? I can't imagine like the anyone thinks that the doctor in Pennsylvania is actually going to remove herself from the country. But like, what is the point of this? Is it ineptitude and just like DOGE showing itself to be the complete mess that it is, or is it actually a concerted project?
Right. Yeah. No, it's very confusing. I do think it probably is DOGE's sloppiness, but I think we're going to see a lot of this across government. Just to sort of conclude this, apparently in the last 10 weeks, tourism to the United States from other countries is down 40%.
Yeah. I heard $91 billion is predicted. I believe it was Goldman Sachs predicted that the U.S. will lose $91 billion in tourism revenue. And of course, that falls very disproportionately on certain states over others, right? Florida is going to be decimated by this.
Yes.
And
yeah. Well, okay. So let's turn to something bizarre. Let's talk about what we want to go viral. I've got a real doozy in my pocket, but what do you have, Neil?
All right. Well, I'm going to share a piece that actually in some ways connects to our conversation in ways I hadn't totally anticipated, but that have been drawn out through our conversation today. So this is a piece that came out today, Good Friday, from Elizabeth Diaz and Ruth Graham, who are the New York Times star reporters on all things religion. And the piece is titled White House of Worship, Trump Elevates Christian Prayer and Power. Evangelical leaders are relishing the new atmosphere at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and greater access to the president. It sort of uses the occasion of Holy Week and the particular ways in which this White House has really amplified Easter messaging this past week as an entry into a larger reported piece on just sort of the role of of pastors in this Trump administration. There's basically a revolving door at the White House where all these folks are coming in and out in a much faster clip than in sort of normal other presidential administrations. But also two things that I think are interesting that I'll just point out quickly. One is it focuses a lot on Paula White Cain, who is the charismatic preacher actually out of Orlando, Florida, who is now in charge of the White House office of, I'm looking for what the actual title is. I'm blanking on the government title or the office title for this. Religious outreach or whatever.
Your Office of God.
That sounds exactly right. Anyway, this is an office that was created by Bush in 2000 or in the early 2000s. As the article points out, when it was originally created, Bush really intended it, and it worked to sort of direct federal funds to faith-based groups and sort of to run government monies through these social service organizations. And there was a lot of, controversy around that at the time, as this is a violation of the First Amendment and all that. But it was put in place. Obama administration certainly continued the practice of it. But the real transformation of it here is that it's no longer about sort of using government monies to support, charitable endeavors by religious organizations. This is about basically using the office to pursue what it's calling anti-Christian bias, and religious freedom as incredibly narrowly conceived as really relating to evangelical Christianity. And this has become an office that, in like many other departments or offices of this administration, are about pursuing a very, very particular agenda that's not in keeping with the sort of historic mission that these places have served. The other thing that I think is really interesting about that this article mentions, but really doesn't make a big deal of, is that almost all of the folks that we're talking about here, in terms of the religious leaders and the people that are close to the president, are charismatic Christians. And that, to me, is an incredibly significant development, because if you look at the longer history of evangelical political activism, and really evangelicalism in American culture, Pentecostals and charismatics have been at the fringe of the evangelical movement, often regarded as, heretics or as false teachers, for all sorts of, theological disputes that have, played out through the years. This was really pronounced in the 1980s, when charismatics and Pentecostals were sort of growing in number and influence, and you had like sort of mainstream evangelical leaders saying charismatic Christianity is a false form of our religion. That has almost all disappeared over time for a number of reasons, including that, charismatics and Pentecostals have sort of cleaned themselves up in a lot of ways.
No more snake handling and stuff.
Well, no more snake handling, and also like really downplaying speaking in tongues and all those sorts of things to sort of mainstream themselves. Not to say that those things don't still happen, but they've really sort of downplayed those as aspects of the faith in order to gain sort of evangelical legitimacy. But I would just argue that I think an article like this points out that the greatest legitimization is access to political power, which the Trump administration has granted them in abundance. So I think that that's sort of an underdeveloped part of this piece that I just sort of want to signal as a historian of American religion. But it's a really interesting piece that people should read in today's New York Times.
Really interesting, Neil. And, this may seem like a strange question, but are all of these people white? I mean, I'm asking for a reason.
So that's a good question. No, a lot of them are Hispanic, and I think that's important here. And then there's a token Black person here and there in this, but you do see a higher visibility of Hispanics in this space because of that charismatic aspect of it. Not to say that there aren't lots and lots of Hispanic evangelicals that sort of reside in the sort of mainline or the mainstream place of evangelicalism. But there are some high profile Hispanic figures here that are more of the Pentecostal, more of the charismatic branch of Christianity.
The reason I asked the question is I was thinking back, and, Jimmy Carter really brings religion into the White House, but he doesn't bring other religious people into the White House. And we really see Reagan beginning to bring religious people into the White House, in part because he, to put it crudely, actually needs some Black people to come to the White House. And the only people he can get to come are the presidents of HBCUs, who rely on the president for their funding, and Black ministers. And so there's this period, certainly in the first Reagan administration, where all the sort of high profile Christian events are pretty heavily Black. And it's a way of sort of doing two jobs at the same time, which is certainly not to suggest that Ronald Reagan was insincere in his faith, nevertheless. But it's interesting to me what you're sketching out here, which is that a set of religious have moved from the fringes to the center. Like there's a sort of vacuum being created because traditional religions don't really want to have much to do with this president. Yeah. Interesting. All right. Well, we're going to go from God to fornication. And I want to go viral this week. Dana Mattioli's piece in the Wall Street Journal, the tactics Elon Musk uses to manage his legion of babies and their mothers. Now, on the show, we have talked before about Elon Musk's many children. He claims 14. Most people think there are a great many more of them. But what's interesting about this article is how unbelievably loony Elon Musk is. And it sort of links together his space exploration projects with this reproductive project. Musk is profoundly concerned about people not having enough babies, but he's also profoundly concerned about the right babies being born. And he believes that the right babies are babies that have quality sperm like his. And so there are all of these women. He actually had a wife. Then there's Grimes, who's one of his girlfriends. Then there's a woman whose last name is Zilla, who I believe was a finance person who worked for him. And now there's this woman named St. Clair who has popped up with another baby. But apparently Elon Musk sort of like goes through Twitter and finds women and interacts with them and then reaches out and says, basically, do you want my sperm? Ashley St. Clair and Elon Musk actually had a relationship. She got pregnant. And while she was pregnant, Musk then said, actually, we should use a whole bunch of surrogates and get a lot of other women pregnant too. Apparently, there is a compound in Austin where he wants to house all of the mothers and the children together. And it's all unbelievably creepy and weird. He also doesn't believe in vaginal birth because he believes that kills brain cells. So he tries to get his mothers to have cesareans. Okay, so I started thinking about, is this just like nuts? And then I thought, no, actually it isn't. And I thought of two historical examples in which men have used their reproductive capacity to imagine whole other worlds. And because we are both historians, Neil, guess who I'm thinking about?
I don't know where you're going with this, but I think it could be really obvious when you tell me.
Okay, first, I'm thinking American slavery.
Oh,
in which plantation owners would often deliberately, there was a certain amount of lust and cruelty and torture and so on involved, but impregnating enslaved women was also an economic project. And it was a project of creating a domain within which the plantation owner was king. And that plantation owner also often had a wife and white children. We know from the stories about Thomas Jefferson that the white Jeffersons and the black Jeffersons interacted as a master class and a servant class. And so that was one thing I was thinking about, of those plantation owners, those white men spreading their sperm around to create little kingdoms for themselves. But then the other thing, and Neil, tell me if I'm going too far with this. As I say, you're the historian of religion. But I was thinking of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and the creation of a new Zion in Utah that would be populated by the descendants of the original Mormon pioneers. And of course, Musk sees himself as he calls the children his legion, that he needs to raise this legion to sort of create a new world that will replace the old corrupt one. But that's what the Mormons were doing too. And then when I read about like the compound, I was like, oh my God, it's Big Love all over again.
And the race to space. I think that the sort of like putting it like the cosmology of it all. Absolutely. Yes. As soon as you talked about American enslavement, I started thinking about the Joseph Smith project here. All of that. Your point about sort of Elon as king reminded me of the point I didn't make with my article, which ties into the conversation we've had today, because one of the things you pointed out over and over again is the king's law versus constitutional law, and the ways in which Trump is leaning towards the monarchical version of the law. Right. One of the things that stuck out to me in this piece was that apparently a lot of the religious leaders around Trump are constantly talking about God's favor on kings throughout history.
Wow.
That like the model that he is being told, and this is connected to the assassination attempt on him, because that's seen as the sort of proof of his divine selection, which was already always there in Trump's sort of rise in 2016, but now has been supercharged with this assassination attempt on him validation that he's been divinely selected to lead the nation now, and that the historical analogs are kings
Right.
who God favored. So, yeah, lots of kingly stuff happening here. I mean, I'm still waiting for these two kings to go at it with each other, but
Right.
I couldn't bring myself to read this piece because
I know a
I'm
lot of
trying to,
people who started and couldn't finish it because it's
I'm
so
trying to
gross.
limit my exposure to all things
Yes.
Musk, but also like if you are online, you can't help but take in a lot of this stuff anyway. But the compound in Austin, I didn't know about. This is really gross.
It's so creepy. And also that he just like offers his sperm to women.
Yeah, yeah,
And that if you have his child, you get $15 million and you get $100,000 a month, but you're never allowed to do anything that he can't control. So
insane.
that Grimes, for example, got into all kinds of trouble and basically has bankrupted herself, suing him over the custody arrangements. Like he just,
Hmm.
takes that little X off for weeks at a time and doesn't
But also,
return him.
and also apparently, if you don't, and importantly, if you don't take up his offer, he can ruin your life, which is
Right,
the case with one of the women who was apparently
right,
reported about in this piece, who I think was some sort of conservative influencer on X that he
right,
reached out to, and
right,
she turned him down and then sort of spoke out about it publicly, and then he de-verified her on Twitter,
right,
which has caused her to basically
right.
lose all of her income.
Right.
So
Her name is Tiffany Fong, I
Fong,
think.
right? Yeah,
And what's interesting about her is all the other women are white. She's the only Asian woman.
yep,
And so Musk is also doing this like heavily eugenic thing.
absolutely.
That, well, it's just ugly and racist. And weird. And this man is like, has power in our government. All right. Neil, is there anything cheerful we can give our listeners before we go?
I mean, it's Easter weekend. The daffodils are blooming.
Yes.
Like maybe just go
Yes.
out and touch grass and like look at
The bunnies
flowers.
are
And
coming. Yes. Yes. I know. It's springtime. All right. Good for you, Neil. And that's it until next week.
all right, sounds good. Talk to you then.
Okay. Bye.